extensions whip strategies today. A little bit about me. That's not that relevant, but yeah, I'm Henrik. I'm the co-coach of Team Latvia, and I've been coaching Edinburgh Trades Union last year and the year before. Yep, fantastic. Right, so for today, a couple of things. So firstly, what constitutes actually like a closing half in BP? That is to say, member and whip speeches. We're going to talk about member strategies, whip strategies, what to avoid and what to take into consideration, perhaps when constructing both speeches. Then a lot of common mistakes that people sometimes make, especially knowing that sometimes people think that whips are something magical and no one really knows how to do them, probably myself included. And then perhaps emotional analysis, depending on how much time we have or how many people are in the call. But yeah, let's crack on with it. So a bit wordy, I know, but I'll try to condense everything as I speak, and then when I release the slides, at least people have a thorough understanding of what's meant in the whip strategies. But okay, let's start with the member, because that comes chronologically first. 3 things in a member speech. So the first one is the setup. 3 things usually are included in a member's setup. 1 is the flaws in the opening themes. That is to say, perhaps some of the arguments that I talk about are not relevant to the debate, or perhaps they've set up an incorrect or uncharitable context that usually applies to geographic locations, for example, setting the debate exclusively in the developed world or exclusively in the developing world, perhaps sometimes different ethnic contexts that teams just cherry pick to make their arguments sound stronger, necessarily perform better. So that's the first thing, to identify them and probably make sure that the judges know that you know that these are the flaws. Second thing is obviously the ways in which you could fix those issues in your case by perhaps addressing the relevant groups of people, introducing different arguments that target different points of relevance in the debate. For example, timelines. So if a policy is introduced in short term, then probably the impacts are accrued over short time, but perhaps there are different positive and negative impacts in the long term. And that is the member's job or responsibility to introduce these relevant contexts and to correct, as we say, the debate for the future. The third one is the context in which your arguments will exist. That is also a correction that you make in the opening team's cases by saying that perhaps the debate is not that narrow, or perhaps the debate might be more narrow than initially thought because of where most of the impacts happen. For example, when talking about ethnic groups and minorities, perhaps generalizing the debate to every person on Earth is a bit too wide and probably disregarding some groups of people that are not affected by the policy can strengthen your case, or at least seemingly prove that you know what you're talking about. Then the member speech, of course, includes the actual extension. That is where the core contingency is brought in as the first thing. So for those perhaps not that familiar with what a core contingency is, it's just a thing or like a statement or an event that needs to be true or exists for your arguments to work. For example, for all of the distribution policies in general welfare programs, governments need quite a lot of money to support them. A core contingency then would be proving that governments actually have perhaps that much money, which is very common in debates for a lot of teams to claim enormous impacts or redistribution schemes for millions of people to the extent that they could actually live a life as with a universal basic income, but not quite proving that governments are actually feasibly able to offer that much money. So that would be a core contingency, which is usually what the cases are set up on and what is usually targeted first. Obviously, the second thing that comes are the arguments. Those are the things where you explain how perhaps you can get to your impact A by trying to prove things like likelihood. That is to say, that's the event chain that you're describing is likely to happen, and people will, let's say, likely to buy into your welfare schemes if that's the debate. Why exactly the thing you're doing is the thing that creates change. That's usually called a pivot or a tipping point. That is to say that we could do a million different things, 99,999 of which they might not work, but perhaps one does. And why exactly that is the thing that works is also something that requires explanation. And lastly, into the actual extension bit, there's the analysis of difference. That is to say that for closing team, especially the member not to be a derivative of the opening teams, they need to provide nuance of what differentiates their case with the openings team. opening team's case. Some of you might perhaps notice that there's a slight redundancy, because in the setup already there's an explanation of discrepancies between opening and closing cases. But I think this just allows you to solidify your inbuilt material in the debate and perhaps position you better. Lastly, there's the rebuttal. Usually rebuttal comes first. Nevertheless, I've included it last because I strongly believe that rebuilding and setup should come first, because as I'll explain later, I have a strong suspicion that a lot of the times members actually miss some of the core material because they try to do quite a lot of rebuttal at the beginning. But then again, a collection of relevant core claims, as said before, not all arguments are important, hence prioritizing them not only in whip but in member is quite crucial. And lastly, here in rebuttal, having non-derivative forms of responses, that is to say, perhaps not repeating the same responses that opening teams have given, but trying to come up with new ones, perhaps stronger ones or more nuanced ones help, especially when judges try to weigh stuff like engagement in the debates. Lastly, a bit of a caveat. I'll explain that a bit more thoroughly in the strategy part. Actually, is depending on the amount of material the delivered, members can try to preemptively weigh. That is usually left for whips to do, but sometimes people find themselves in situations where they cannot come up with a lot of material for specific debates. So therefore, to avoid losing time or just misallocating time, sometimes members are welcome and do that in terms of preemptive weighing. So that's basically what goes in a member speech. I suppose I can take questions now or later. That doesn't really matter. But yeah, you can raise your hand if you want to ask a question. If not, then I'll just move on and just take questions in bulk after everything. Right, then the whip. Same things, except for the rebuttal. Let's start with the setup. So firstly, and most crucially, whips usually need to get an understanding of the debate by creating a selective outline of it. That is to say, not all arguments are important. Most likely, most arguments are not important. Probably there are 2 to 3 arguments that actually matter and can win or lose debates. And having the outline on paper or just knowing it by heart can help a lot when prioritizing responses. Second, criteria by which you would like the adjudicators to adjudicate the debates. That is also sometimes known as burdens of proof. I think there's a bit of a discrepancy there, but for the sake of this workshop, I think that's fine to assume that they're the same. But yeah, basically setting some standards or things that should be changed or implemented in the debate for a team to win, or things that need to be proven for a case to work, like core contingencies. Lastly, a positioning. Usually, closing teams tend to, especially closing opposition, tend to be outframed or misclashed in the debates because they try to bring in something very unique without doing the positioning bit, which is to say that teams need to tell the judges where do they fit in the debate exactly, and if there have been any holes that are left in openings cases that member addresses, then the whip can say that we are filling exactly these holes, and this is why that it's important, for example, because otherwise openings case doesn't work. And then the actual whip bit in a whip speech, starting with the clarifications. I think most whip speakers start off their speeches actually with clarifications, which is to say, obviously whips aren't capable because of time constraints to deal with every single claim that's been brought out. So saying why sometimes arguments are irrelevant and thus will not be tackled any further is important, because that allows judges to understand the reasoning behind you missing certain bits. Judges never expect you to actually target every single claim, but it's important to say why you're not tackling specific ones. And the second thing applies this in the same way, just to teams. Sometimes teams bring cases that are just become redundant by the end of the debate. There's usually the classic shift top half to back half, where back half starts to bring in more nuanced and more important arguments, therefore making opening half rather redundant. And that is what this B point explains, is trying to suggest that the judges that perhaps some teams are out of clash and therefore should not be relevant. Second thing a whip should do is rebuilding. I would suggest everyone to think about it this way. Ask yourself or ask your partner, if we would lose, what would be the points that we lose on, or where would that happen in our case? that usually eliminates, at least in empirical experience of mine, it eliminates 7 out of 10 claims that you could actually lose on. And therefore, being able to target that specific claim by knowing where it is can greatly improve your chances of actually winning. And then on the weighing bits and the rebuttal bits, the first thing to do is to pick a strategy depending on the extension that you're running and the quality of the debate. We'll explain that in strategies a lot more thoroughly, but for now, there's 3 strategies. The first one is clash by clash, where you select 2 to 4 usually clashes that teams have brought in that you think are relevant and that could win the debate, and trying to prove why those clashes, you win on those clashes. That of course assumes that your material is in the clash in question, which not always is the case, but tends to happen. Therefore, a clash by clash strategy might work. The second and most common one is team by team, where instead of trying to search for clashes and how to beat the clashes, whips generally just tend to target specific teams and try to beat the argument strands that are coming out of them. And lastly is composite, by doing both, starting by clash, if there's, for example, a single clash, and then just tackling team by team to remove the remaining bits of material, if one could say, from the table. And lastly, basically analysis on why your partner's responses are better, why your case is better. That's usually integrated in the strategy and the weighing bits by choosing the strategy. But I think a lot of whips tend to miss the response bits, trying to prove why these new responses that the whip or the member might have brought in are better than the other responses, as opposed to just focusing on the material. Right. So then strategies. Yeah. So let's start with member. I think these are what differentiates whips that are and members that are perhaps not that experienced from the bases that are quite experienced. Let's start with the member then. So first things first, in a messy debate, as I explained before about the strategies, I'd suggest in a messy debate to have a new extension plus an analysis extension. So what I mean with a new extension is some argument that has a fundamentally different core premise from those arguments that have been already introduced. An analysis extension is something that builds on the same premise of another team, commonly of the same bench, which is therefore like developed further in the debate. That's called the eggs in 2 baskets approach or eggs in multiple baskets approach, because usually in messy debates, it's difficult to understand and try to figure out which one is the winning clash or what might be the relevant clashes. Therefore, bringing a new argument, analysis extension, you're sort of splitting the loads of if your judgment of the clashes was wrong, at least you have an analysis extension and vice versa. Secondly, in a clear debate, usually it's recommended to have fewer but more thorough extensions because it seems clear where the clashes lie, and focusing an extension on a specific clash that could be winning is usually better in terms of winning, and especially proving why there's sometimes nuances lacking in top half because time constraints and stuff like that. You can greatly, I think, improve your chances of thirdly, in cases of backloading or matter dumping, that matter dumping especially applies to closing opposition's member, because closing government's members usually or sometimes tend to matter dump a lot of material, a lot of arguments that need to be dealt with. Backloading usually applies to the government member, where the opening opposition usually just gets a lot of arguments out in the second speech. In those cases, it's usually recommended to offload some of the responses to whip, not to miss crucial analysis on your own material. I do understand, however, of course, that that's sort of illegal, or at least frowned upon, to introduce new responses to whip, but I think whips usually deal with it pretty well. We're trying to mask them as just rebuilding steps, which usually tends to happen, and judges accept that. And lastly, just to try to take a diagonal POI, that's usually the top half engagements. I would suggest to do that in member, because at least then their arguments are still fresh, rather than doing that in the whip, and that which just promotes the engagement of the debate, which is usually what judges like. Then for whips, for the new extension, or if a new extension is brought up by the member, whips should concentrate on the actual core idea as opposed to the nuances that they bring or the impacts, because that's most likely to be targeted in the debate or lose the debate if not proven fully. Secondly, in analysis extension, probably whipping the nuance or the difference in the debate your additions to the arguments make is crucial, because otherwise you might be framed as being derivative. Thirdly, taking a back half POI. So to make sure that engagement happens both in top half and back half is crucial here. Obviously, these steps of who takes back half and who takes a diagonal POI can be switched up, but as said, I'd prefer myself at least to take a diagonal POI if I was a member. Fourthly, in messy debates, choosing team-by-team strategies usually is better because, as said before, identifying clashes and burdens of proof in messy debates is difficult. Therefore, just sticking to what teams have said is easier and usually more reliable. And fifthly, in clear debates, choosing clash by clash, because usually if a debate's clear, the clashes are clear, and therefore identifying the specific clashes that could win you the debate not only removes the redundancies in your speech, but also signals to the judges that you have a clear understanding of where the debate's going and you have a clear winning strategy, which is why I'm specifically focusing on, let's say, 1 or 2 clashes. Right, I hope that makes sense. Now, common flaws. I think this is usually where people start to ask had asked questions. So I'm trying to figure out what were those questions a while back and trying to compile them and try to limit the common flaws then. Yeah, so for member, the biggest flaw, I think, or the most common flaw I've seen is assuming that a new extension constitutes the winning extension. It's very rarely, in fact, the case, but I think teams just fear being derivative and misclash. Therefore, they introduce new extensions, but usually tends to underdevelop them, hence leading to having no winning extensions, actually. Second thing is the opposite of that, aka being derivative. That's usually solved by having a new extension. That is to say that points 1 and 2 apply as extremes in the same scenario. Third one is having no clear position and stance. That's what I talked about previously when talking about positioning in debates and judges understanding where your material fits in or is clashing. Fourthly, missing impact due to time constraints. Again, that's why I usually prefer doing rebuttal in the later stages of a member's speech to avoid missing specific impacts and just relying on the whip to be able to deliver some of those responses. Fifthly, not communicating with the whip or, in fact, in any position with your teammates on material lost or underdeveloped is usually one of the biggest flaws, because whips sometimes tend to focus on their speeches a lot during the late stages of a debate, therefore not listening to their own partner's speeches, which means that if a member doesn't develop a specific point and whip doesn't pick up on it, that point is literally lost in the debates, which is usually not only a redundancy in time, therefore, but also limits the depth of your material or the extent of it. And lastly, this is a bit ironic, but being unrealistic and lying, I think members are notorious for trying to claim that the top half is always a deadlock or a gridlock, depending on which side of the pond you're from. But and usually trying to say that the impacts are unrealistic, or actually doing the opposite, or trying to claim that their impacts are the most realistic, even though they might be very far-fetched from reality. So I think here, members usually need to be more realistic and truthful to themselves and to others in the debate. In terms of whips, I think the most common claim is, in terms of strategy, and prioritization, is attempting to rebut every single claim. That usually makes them bogged down in weighing. There's not enough time left, and usually then it just turns out into a response speech of sorts without any weighing, therefore making the team unlikely to win. Second is not adapting to changes in the material. Debates are very fluid and dynamic, depending on what material has been brought out in top half. Perhaps your material no longer applies, has been taken, or in any case, just isn't relevant to the debate anymore. Whips should be able to adapt to new materials, to new strands and new strategies quite swiftly. That's why usually most really good whips do not write their speeches. They just compile a couple of notes throughout the debates. And then in the last bits, in the last few minutes, they write an actual structure on the speech, which allows them to basically adapt it till the very, very last minute. Third one is mixing up weighing and rebuttal. For everyone, I might just try to remind that rebuttal doesn't assume a claim to be true. It usually says it usually gives reasons of why a claim is false, whereas weighing assumes an argument to be true to begin with, and then tries to suggest reasons why it should still be discredited. I think sometimes people call rebuttal weighing and vice versa, by never assuming that an argument could be true in practice. Think about it as an even if, but in terms of relevance. Fourth one is misclashing or picking the wrong strategy. That's hard to sometimes do because there's no clear line of when a debate is really messy and when it is really clear. It's usually somewhere in between, but picking the wrong strategy can sometimes bog speakers down, especially if they have a lot of material to deal with, and they pick the team by team strategy. Usually difficult to get to the last team, and therefore probably allow them to win by not rebutting them so much. And lastly, being uncharitable to teams. This is usually because of time constraints that speakers rush in their speeches, and try to discredit a lot of core premises with 2 or even 1 point of rebuttal, therefore making seemingly their case very one-sided or very one-dimensional, or strawmanning, if you will. That's usually fixed by trying to strategize better. That's we call into point number 1 in web flows, and therefore allocating more time to just deal with speech-specific things. So yeah, I think that's around 20 minutes. Yeah, so I have a practice motion, but before then, it depends, of course, like if people are willing to practice motions and stuff, or like I can just give the motion, people can think of arguments and try to utilize these strategies. But before then, perhaps if there are any questions, I'm willing to answer them now.
I don't have any questions, but perhaps you can explain the exercise and then we can stop the recording after that and talk about the exercise more in detail.
Yeah, okay, fantastic, yeah, for sure. Right, so what my plan was is I would give a motion, and depending on how many people we have, I think it'd be valuable to identify what could be the potential back half arguments, and then seeing how some of the strategies might be applied depending on the debates. For example, if we come up with 4, let's say, arguments for back half, usually quite a lot, but regardless, and then trying to figure out which ones would be more relevant, which ones would be more valuable to discount in the debates because of relevance, and which ones might we keep and therefore develop. So yeah, I have a motion as well for that. Yeah, by the way.
Yeah, I think that sounds good. If you can show the motion, because then if anyone is watching the recording afterwards, they can still do the exercise.
Right,
but they
right.
don't
Yeah,
have to listen to us do it.
yeah, fantastic. So yeah, that's the motion. I think a very deep motion to have. Yeah, the racial minority groups should shield their children from the concept of racism for as long as possible. I note for everyone watching this as a recording, this is a this house believes that motion as opposed to this house would. So that means that a model is not necessary, but I suppose if you guys want to do that as a practice to introduce models, this motion is perfect for that as well. Just change the this house believes to this house would.